The rain fell in relentless sheets that evening, drenching the bustling streets of New York City. Ethan Donovan, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, barely noticed the weather as he exited the gleaming tower where his office occupied the top floor. A driver waited with an umbrella, but Ethan waved him off, choosing to walk. His mind was heavy with the usual concerns: mergers, investments, quarterly reports, anything to keep him from thinking about the past. As he strode briskly down the slick sidewalk, something caught his eye. A small figure huddled near the entrance of an old diner, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Ethan slowed, his steps faltering as the child's frame shuddered in the cold. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue, and he clutched a crumpled paper bag to his chest. Ethan paused, his heart clenching at the sight, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He had become a master at avoiding emotional entanglements, an armor forged from loss and regret. Yet something about this child pierced through it, stirring memories he had fought to suppress. The boy glanced up, his eyes meeting Ethan's. They were startlingly bright, even in the dim light, filled with a strange mixture of defiance and vulnerability. Ethan hesitated, unsure of what to do. The city was full of people in need, and he wasn't a savior. He was a businessman. But those eyes, they reminded him of someone. "Hey," Ethan said, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "What are you doing out here in this weather?" The boy flinched but didn't respond. Ethan tried again. "Are you hungry? Do you need help?" The boy's voice, when it finally came, was hoarse. "I'm fine. Just go." Ethan straightened, conflicted. He could walk away, just like everyone else, and convince himself he had done enough by asking. But the image of the boy sitting there, shaking in the rain, gnawed at him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling someone to help you," he said, his tone firm. "You're not staying out here." The boy's eyes widened in panic. "No, don't call anyone. I don't want them to take me away." Ethan froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Memories of hospital rooms and unanswered prayers surged to the surface, unbidden and unwelcome. He pushed them down, forcing himself to focus on the present. "All right," Ethan said slowly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "But you can't stay here. Come with me. We'll figure something out." The boy didn't move at first, his small frame rigid with suspicion. Ethan sighed, pulling off his coat and draping it over the boy's shoulders. "I'm not going to hurt you. Just trust me, okay?" After a moment's hesitation, the boy nodded. Ethan extended a hand, and the boy took it tentatively. Together, they walked toward the car waiting at the curb. Once inside, the boy huddled in the warmth of the leather seat, clutching the coat around him like a lifeline. Ethan studied him from the corner of his eye. The boy's face was pale but striking, with sharp cheekbones and a determined set to his jaw. There was something hauntingly familiar about him, but Ethan couldn't place it. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. "Benji," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right, Benji. My name's Ethan." He paused. "Where are your parents?" Benji's expression darkened, and he looked away. Ethan didn't press. Instead, he directed the driver to the nearest hospital. Benji needed warmth, food, and medical attention. Everything else could wait. When they arrived, Ethan carried the boy inside, his small frame feeling impossibly light. The staff moved quickly, wrapping Benji in blankets and hooking him up 2 and 4. Ethan stayed nearby, watching as the boy relaxed under their care. Hours later, as the nurses stepped out, Benji turned to Ethan, his eyes wary but grateful. "Why did you help me?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. "Because I couldn't just leave you there," he said finally. Benji studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, in a voice filled with quiet determination, he said, "I have 5 wishes." Ethan blinked. "Wishes?" The boy nodded. "I've been thinking about them for a long time. If I tell you, will you promise to listen?" Ethan didn't know what to say. This wasn't a negotiation, a deal he could close with a signature. It was something raw and deeply human. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "I'm listening." Benji's voice was soft but steady as he began to list them. I want to eat a big meal without worrying if there'll be more food tomorrow. I want to sleep in a bed, not on the ground. I want to know what it's like to have a family. I want to go to school. And he hesitated, his voice trembling. I want to find my dad. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. The simplicity of the boy's wishes was devastating. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded. We'll start with the first one, he said, his voice thick. I promise. Ethan stared at the boy lying in the hospital bed, his fragile frame barely making a dent in the sheets. Benji's words echoed in his mind, each one a weight pressing on his chest. 5 wishes. Simple, yet profound. They revealed not only the hardships the boy had faced, but also the hope he still clung to, despite everything. As Ethan sat in the quiet room, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant reminding him of the gala he was supposed to attend that evening. The event was important, a networking opportunity with key investors. Normally, he wouldn't hesitate to prioritize business. But tonight, the idea of leaving Benji alone felt wrong. He silenced the phone and leaned back in his chair. Benji stirred, his eyes fluttering open. When he saw Ethan still there, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. You didn't leave? No, Ethan replied simply. Figured someone should stick around. Benji looked away, fiddling with the edge of the blanket. You don't have to. I'll be fine. Ethan shook his head. You don't have to do this alone. At least not tonight. The boy didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't used to having someone stay. Ethan's mind wandered to the boy's last wish, to find his father. He had avoided asking too many questions earlier, sensing Benji's reluctance, but the thought lingered. Where was this father he wanted so desperately to find? What had happened to leave the boy abandoned and alone? A nurse entered, carrying a tray of soup and bread. She set it on the small table beside the bed and smiled at Benji. Here you go, sweetheart. Let's get some food in you. Benji's eyes lit up at the sight of the meal. He sat up slowly, wincing as he moved. Ethan reached over instinctively, helping him adjust the pillows. The boy murmured a quiet, thanks, before picking up the spoon. As Benji ate, Ethan watched him closely. The way he savored each bite, as if he didn't know when his next meal might come, tugged at something deep inside Ethan. He remembered the lavish dinners he often attended, where food was an afterthought to the deals being made. How different his world was from Benji's, and yet, in this moment, he felt connected to the boy in a way he couldn't explain. When Benji finished, he leaned back against the pillows, his eyelids drooping. Ethan thought he might fall asleep, but then the boy spoke. Do you think it's dumb to believe in wishes? Ethan hesitated, unsure how to answer. He thought about his own life, the things he had wished for and lost. I don't think it's dumb, he said finally. I think it takes courage to hope for something, especially when it feels impossible. Benji studied him for a moment, then nodded. I've been making those wishes since I can remember. I used to think maybe someone out there would hear them, like a magic genie or something. But nobody ever did. Maybe it's not about someone else hearing them, Ethan said. Maybe it's about finding people who can help make them come true. The boy didn't reply, but a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was a fleeting expression, but it gave Ethan a strange sense of purpose. The next morning, Ethan made a call to his assistant, asking her to arrange for Benji to stay in a safe place once he was discharged from the hospital. He also tasked her with finding a private investigator. If Benji wanted to find his father, Ethan would do everything in his power to make it happen. Later that day, when Benji woke up, Ethan told him about the plan. You'll stay somewhere comfortable while we figure things out, he said. And I'll help you with those wishes. Benji's eyes widened. You mean it? I mean it, Ethan replied. But you'll have to trust me. The boy nodded, his expression a mixture of hope and disbelief. Okay. Over the next few days, Ethan kept his word. He arranged for Benji to stay in a small but cozy apartment owned by his company. He stocked the kitchen with food, brought in warm blankets, and even found a tutor to help him catch up on schoolwork. Each step was met with cautious gratitude from Benji, as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. But despite the progress, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Benji's story. He spent hours with the investigator, piecing together fragments of the boy's past. The records were sparse, but one detail stood out. Benji had been placed in foster care after being found as a toddler near the site of a car accident. The file mentioned no family, no parents, only a single photograph taken by a social worker, a blurry image of a smiling boy with bright eyes. Ethan stared at the photograph, a strange sense of familiarity washing over him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the boy's face felt connected. He dismissed the thought, focusing instead on the task at hand. There were still too many unanswered questions. One evening, as they sat together in the apartment, Benji turned to Ethan. "Why are you doing all this? You don't even know me." Ethan considered the question carefully. "Because I see something in you," he said, "and because I know what it's like to feel lost." Benji tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. You don't seem lost. You're rich, and you have everything." Ethan's chest tightened. He thought of the empty mansion he returned to each night, the rooms filled with silence and memories. "Having everything doesn't mean you're not missing something," he said quietly. The boy nodded, as if understanding more than Ethan expected. For the first time, Ethan felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. But as the days passed, the pieces of Benji's story began to fall into place, and with them came a growing unease. The more Ethan learned, the more he felt that their meeting was no coincidence. Something deeper was at play, something that would change everything. Ethan sat in his office late one night, staring at the photograph the investigator had uncovered. The boy in the picture, so young and full of life, bore a striking resemblance to Benji. But it wasn't just the physical likeness that unsettled him. It was the uncanny familiarity, as if he had seen that face before in a dream or a memory that refused to surface fully. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Over the past week, his life had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. Meetings and deals that once seemed paramount now felt insignificant compared to the task of unraveling the mystery of Benji's past. For the first time in years, Ethan felt driven by something other than profit, a quiet, insistent pull to give the boy a chance at a better life. His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was the investigator. Ethan answered immediately. "I found something," the investigator said, his tone serious. "It's about the accident Benji was found near. There's more to it than we initially thought." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" "There were records of a child being pulled from the wreckage, a boy about Benji's age at the time. The child was reported missing shortly afterward, and the case was closed without resolution. It's unusual, to say the least." Ethan's chest constricted. His own tragedy flashed through his mind. The car accident that had taken his wife and son years ago. The police had declared his son dead at the scene, but the body had never been recovered. It was a fact that had haunted him for years, though he had forced himself to accept it as truth. Could it be possible? No, it was absurd. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. Yet, the coincidence was too glaring to ignore. "What else did you find?" he asked, his voice taut. "I traced the foster families Benji was placed with. None of them kept him for long. He moved from home to home until he ended up on the streets. But here's the thing. One of the social workers mentioned that he always clung to a locket when he was younger. I'm trying to track it down." A locket. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. His son had worn a locket, a gift from his mother, with a small engraving on the back. Forever, no matter what. He hadn't thought about it in years, but now the memory surged forward with startling clarity. "I need to see it," Ethan said firmly. "As soon as you find it." The investigator promised to follow up, and Ethan ended the call. He sat in silence, the weight of possibility pressing down on him. If Benji was his son, the thought was almost too much to bear. Could he allow himself to hope after all these years? The next morning, Ethan arrived at the apartment to find Benji sitting at the small kitchen table, drawing on a scrap of paper. The boy looked up and smiled, a small, cautious smile that made Ethan's chest ache. "What are you working on?" Ethan asked, pulling out a chair to sit beside him. Benji pushed the paper toward him. It was a crude but heartfelt sketch of a house, with two figures standing in front. One was clearly a child, and the other, a tall man with dark hair. "It's us," Benji said, his voice shy. "I don't know what you're going to do when all this is over, but I kind of like having you around." Ethan's throat tightened. He reached out, ruffling the boy's hair gently. "I like having you around too." Benji beamed, and for a moment, the weight of everything else faded. But it didn't last long. Ethan knew he couldn't keep the boy in the dark forever. If the investigators' findings led where Ethan feared they might, it would change both of their lives irrevocably. Later that day, the investigator called again. "I found the locket," he said, his tone triumphant. "It's with one of the foster families Benji stayed with years ago. They kept it when he left, thinking he might come back for it." Ethan wasted no time. He drove across the city to retrieve the locket, his heart pounding with every mile. When he finally held it in his hands, his breath caught. It was exactly as he remembered. Small, worn, and engraved with those familiar words. Forever, no matter what. He returned to the apartment, the locket burning a hole in his pocket. Benji greeted him at the door, his face lighting up when he saw Ethan, but Ethan could barely meet the boy's gaze. The weight of what he had to say was almost unbearable. "Benji," he began, kneeling to the boy's level. "I need to show you something." He pulled the locket from his pocket and placed it in Benji's hand. The boy stared at it, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I remember this," he said softly. "It used to be mine. I don't know where it came from, though." Ethan swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "It belonged to my son. He wore it the day I lost him." Benji's eyes widened, his small fingers tightening around the locket. "Your son?" Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. I think you might be him." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Benji looked at him, his face a mixture of shock, hope, and disbelief. "You think I'm your son?" "I don't just think," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I believe it, and I'm going to find out for sure." Benji's lip trembled, and for a moment, Ethan thought the boy might cry. Instead, he threw his arms around Ethan, clutching him tightly. "I always wished I had a dad," he whispered. Maybe my wish came true." Ethan held him close, tears burning in his eyes. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the universe was giving him a second chance. The apartment was quiet after Benji fell asleep, but Ethan couldn't relax. His mind raced with everything that had happened in the last few hours. The locket, the memories it had stirred, and Benji's tentative hope. It was all overwhelming. Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the boys' drawing of their imagined house. The simplicity of it struck him. For Benji, having a family, a home, was a dream he clung to. For Ethan, it was a wound he'd spent years trying to ignore. He pulled out his phone and called the investigator again. "I need you to confirm this," he said, his voice low to avoid waking Benji. "DNA, records, whatever it takes. I need to know if he's really my son." "I'm already on it," the investigator assured him. "I'll need a sample from both of you, but I can't expedite the process. Give me a day or two." Ethan hung up and leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling over him. He glanced at the couch where Benji had curled up under a blanket, the locket still clutched in his hand. A quiet resolve formed in Ethan's chest. Whether or not the results confirmed what he suspected, he wouldn't abandon the boy. Benji had already endured enough loss in his short life. Ethan would make sure he never felt alone again. The next morning, Benji woke to the smell of pancakes. He wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, and found Ethan at the stove, a spatula in hand. "Are you cooking?" Benji asked, disbelief coloring his voice. Ethan chuckled. "Don't sound so surprised. I'm not completely useless outside of boardrooms." Benji slid into a chair at the table, watching as Ethan flipped a pancake onto a plate and set it in front of him. The boy's face lit up as he dug in, and Ethan found himself smiling at the sight. It was such a small thing, breakfast, but it felt monumental in a way Ethan couldn't explain. After they ate, Ethan sat Benji down. "There's something we need to do today," he said carefully. "It might help us figure out if we're connected." Benji's brow furrowed. "Connected how?" Ethan hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I think you might be my son. I don't know for sure, but I've been looking into it." That locket you had. It belonged to my boy. Benji's eyes widened, and he stared at Ethan for a long moment. You really think I'm him? Ethan nodded. I do. But we need to be certain. Benji seemed to process this for a moment, then gave a small nod. Okay, what do we have to do? Ethan explained the process briefly, keeping it as simple as possible. They went to a clinic later that day, where both of them provided samples. The staff assured Ethan the results would be rushed, and he left feeling a mixture of anticipation and dread. If the test came back positive, it would change everything. If it didn't, he wasn't sure how he would break that news to Benji. That evening, Ethan and Benji returned to the apartment. The boy was unusually quiet, lost in thought. As they sat together on the couch, Benji finally spoke. If I'm not your son, will you still help me? Ethan's heart ached at the vulnerability in the boy's voice. He turned to face Benji, his expression serious. Of course I will. No matter what the test says, you're not going anywhere. Benji's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded. Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Over the next 2 days, they settled into a tentative routine. Ethan made sure Benji ate well, stayed warm, and caught up on his schoolwork with the help of the tutor he had hired. They went for walks in the park and even spent an afternoon at the local library, where Benji marveled at the rows of books. Ethan found himself enjoying the boy's company more than he expected. It had been years since he'd felt this kind of connection with anyone. On the 3rd day, the call came. Ethan answered it in the hallway, his hands trembling slightly as the investigator spoke. The results are in, the investigator said. It's a match. Benji is your son. Ethan closed his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. Relief, disbelief, and a tidal wave of emotion crashed over him. He thanked the investigator and ended the call, leaning against the wall to steady himself. For years, he had carried the weight of his loss, believing his family was gone forever. And now, against all odds, his son had been returned to him. He walked back into the apartment, his steps measured. Benji looked up from the table where he had been sketching. Did you find out? Ethan nodded, unable to keep the emotion from his voice. You're my son, Benji. It's official. The boy's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he just stared at Ethan. Then, in a sudden burst of movement, he ran into Ethan's arms, holding him tightly. I knew it, Benji whispered. I knew you had to be. Ethan held him close, his own tears falling freely. In that moment, the years of pain and regret seemed to fade, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance, a chance to be the father he had always wanted to be. That night, as Benji slept peacefully for the first time in years, Ethan sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. His mind buzzed with plans for the future. There was so much to do, so much to rebuild, but for the first time, he felt ready. He would give Benji the life he deserved, no matter what it took, and he would make sure that the boy's wishes, all of them, came true. The days after the confirmation of Benji's identity felt surreal to Ethan. He moved through each moment with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, his mind consumed with thoughts of how to make up for the time they had lost. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he was determined to create a future where Benji would never feel abandoned or unloved again. Benji, for his part, seemed to blossom under Ethan's care. The quiet, guarded boy Ethan had first met on the rain-soaked street was beginning to open up. He laughed more, asked questions about the world, and even started talking about things he wanted to do when he got older. Ethan found himself marveling at the resilience of his son, at the strength it must have taken to survive everything he had been through. One morning, as they sat together over breakfast, Benji looked up from his plate. So, what happens now? He asked, his voice hesitant. Am I going to live with you? Ethan paused, carefully setting his coffee mug down. He had been thinking about this question for days, weighing the logistics and implications. But in the end, there was only one answer. Yes, he said firmly. You're my son, Benji. You belong with me. Benji's face lit up with a mixture of relief and joy. Really? You mean it? I mean it, Ethan replied, reaching across the table to ruffle Benji's hair. But it's not just about where you live. We're going to be a family, Benji. That means figuring things out together, one step at a time, The boy nodded, his smile widening. I've never had a family before. Not really. Well, Ethan said with a soft chuckle. Get ready. Families can be messy, but they're worth it. Later that day, Ethan took Benji to his home for the first time. The mansion was a stark contrast to the small apartment they had been staying in, with its towering ceilings, marble floors, and expansive windows that overlooked the city. Benji's eyes grew wide as they walked through the grand entryway, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. This place is huge, Benji said, his voice filled with awe. It's like a castle. Ethan smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his expression. It's been a long time since it felt like a home, he admitted. Maybe you can help me change that. Benji looked up at him, his face serious. I'll try. Over the next few weeks, they began to settle into a new rhythm. Ethan converted one of the spare bedrooms into a space for Benji, letting him choose the colors and decorations. They spent hours shopping for furniture, bedding, and posters of Benji's favorite things. By the time it was finished, the room was a reflection of the boy's personality, bright, warm, and filled with hope. But it wasn't just the physical space that changed. Ethan found himself shifting in ways he hadn't expected. He started coming home earlier from work, setting aside time to have dinner with Benji and listen to him talk about his day. He learned to navigate the world through his son's eyes, finding joy in small things he had long overlooked. A trip to the park, a board game on a rainy afternoon, or even just the sound of Benji's laughter filling the once-empty halls of the house. One evening, as they sat together on the couch watching a movie, Benji turned to Ethan. Do you ever think about Mom? The question caught Ethan off guard, but he nodded. All the time, he said softly. She was kind and funny, and she loved you more than anything. Benji's brow furrowed. What happened to her? You don't talk about it much. Ethan hesitated, the pain of the memory still raw even after all these years. But he knew Benji deserved the truth. We were in a car accident, he said finally. Your mom didn't survive, and for a long time, I thought I had lost you too. Benji's eyes widened. You thought I was gone? Ethan nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I did. It broke me, Benji. Losing you and your mom. It was the hardest thing I've ever been through. Benji was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of Ethan's words. Then he reached out and took Ethan's hand in his small one. But you didn't lose me, he said softly. I'm here now. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes, but he blinked them away, squeezing Benji's hand. You're right, he said, and I'm never letting you go again. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan and Benji grew closer. They celebrated milestones together. Benji's first day at school, his first soccer game, his first birthday party with friends. Ethan threw himself into fatherhood with a determination that surprised even him, finding joy in every moment, no matter how small. But their journey wasn't without challenges. There were nights when Benji woke up crying from nightmares, memories of his time on the streets still haunting him. There were moments when he struggled to trust that this new life was real, that it wouldn't be taken away. And there were times when Ethan, despite his best efforts, felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the task before him. Through it all, they leaned on each other. Ethan learned to be patient, to listen, to reassure Benji that he was safe and loved. And Benji, in turn, taught Ethan the power of resilience and the importance of finding joy in the present. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Benji turned to Ethan. Do you remember my wishes? Ethan smiled. Of course I do. You wanted to eat a big meal, sleep in a warm bed, have a family, go to school, and find your dad. Benji nodded, his expression thoughtful. You made them all come true. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. I couldn't have done it without you, he said. You gave me a reason to believe again. Benji leaned against him, his small frame warm and solid. I think maybe wishes aren't about magic, he said softly. Maybe they're about finding people who care enough to make them happen. Ethan wrapped an arm around his son, holding him close. In that moment, he knew Benji was right. It wasn't magic that had brought them together. It was love, perseverance, and a shared belief that no matter how broken the past, the future could be something beautiful. For the first time in years, Ethan felt at peace. He had found his son, and in doing so, he had found himself. Together, they had turned their pain into something extraordinary, a family built not just on blood, but on hope and second chances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Ethan whispered the words he had carried in his heart since the day they met. Forever, no matter what. And this time, he knew they were true. Life with Benji had become a rhythm Ethan never knew he needed. Days were filled with school drop-offs, work meetings scheduled around soccer practice, and evenings spent reading books together or playing board games. For someone who had spent years buried in the high-stakes world of corporate business, the simplicity of these moments felt like a revelation. They weren't just building a new life together. They were healing old wounds. But one afternoon, as Ethan reviewed paperwork in his office, his assistant knocked and entered with a look of hesitation. "Mr. Donovan," she said, "there's a man here asking to see you. He claims he knows Benji." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Who is he?" "He said his name is Carl," she replied. "He's from one of the foster homes Benji stayed in. Should I send him away?" Ethan stood, his mind racing. "No, I'll see him." Moments later, Carl entered the office, a wiry man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a cautious demeanor. He sat across from Ethan, fidgeting with his worn jacket. "I appreciate you seeing me," Carl began. "I didn't know if I should come, but I heard about what's happening with Benji, and I thought, maybe I should. What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but guarded. Carl hesitated, then pulled a small photo from his pocket. "I took this when Benji was living with us. He wasn't with us long, but my wife and I always felt a connection with him. When he left, we kept hoping we'd hear from him again." Ethan studied the photo. It was a younger Benji, smiling shyly at the camera. His heart ached at the thought of his son passing through so many hands, never finding a permanent home. "Why are you here now?" Carl shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't know where Benji ended up after he left us. But when I saw your story on the news about finding him, I thought I should tell you. Someone came looking for him once." Ethan froze. "Who?" "A man," Carl said. "He showed up at our house, asking questions about Benji. He claimed to be his father, but something about him didn't sit right. He was too pushy, too interested in whether Benji had anything valuable with him. I told him we didn't know where Benji had gone, and he left." Ethan's mind raced. Someone pretending to be Benji's father? It didn't make sense, but it left him unsettled. "Did you ever see him again?" "No," Carl said, "but I thought you should know, just in case. I care about that boy, Mr. Donovan. I just want to make sure he's safe." Ethan nodded, his instincts on high alert. "Thank you for telling me. I'll make sure nothing happens to him." After Carl left, Ethan called the investigator. "I need you to dig into something for me," he said. "There might be someone out there who's looking for Benji, and I need to know who they are." The investigator agreed to start immediately, but the unease lingered. Ethan had worked too hard to rebuild his life with Benji to let anything threaten it now. That evening, Ethan kept the conversation light during dinner, not wanting to worry Benji. But as they sat together watching TV, Benji seemed distracted. "Is something on your mind?" Ethan asked. Benji hesitated, then nodded. "I was thinking about what it would have been like if you hadn't found me." Ethan's chest tightened. "You don't have to think about that anymore. You're here now, and that's what matters." "I know," Benji said, "but sometimes I wonder why it took so long. If you're my dad, why didn't you find me sooner?" Ethan took a deep breath. He had expected this question eventually, but it didn't make it any easier. "When the accident happened," he began carefully, "I was told you didn't survive. I believed it because I didn't have any reason to think otherwise. It was only after meeting you that I started to question everything." Benji looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "So it wasn't your fault?" Ethan shook his head. "No, Benji. If I had known you were out there, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you. I promise you that." The boy nodded slowly, as if absorbing the weight of Ethan's words. "I'm glad you found me," he said softly. "Me too," Ethan replied. "More than you'll ever know." The days passed uneventfully, but the sense of foreboding lingered. Ethan threw himself into his new role as a father, trying to focus on the joy Benji brought into his life. But late one evening, as he was going over work emails, his phone buzzed. It was the investigator. "I found something," the man said without preamble. "The man Carl mentioned? He's not just some stranger. He's connected to the company that managed your late wife's estate." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" "It means he might have had access to information about the accident and about Benji." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "Why would he be looking for Benji?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. But I thought you should know. This might not be random." Ethan ended the call, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story of the accident than he had ever known. If someone had been looking for Benji, it wasn't a coincidence. And if they had access to his wife's estate, it raised questions Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to face. The next morning, Ethan decided to keep Benji close. He canceled his meetings and spent the day with his son, taking him to the park and then to lunch at Benji's favorite burger place. But the unease remained, a shadow he couldn't ignore. As they walked home, Benji looked up at Ethan. "You seem worried," he said. "Is something wrong?" Ethan forced a smile. "Just thinking about work," he said. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Benji wasn't convinced. "You don't have to lie to me," he said. "I can tell when something's bothering you." Ethan sighed, kneeling so he was at Benji's eye level. "There might be someone looking for you," he admitted. "Someone who doesn't have good intentions. But I promise I'll keep you safe, no matter what." Benji nodded, his small hand slipping into Ethan's. "I trust you," he said simply. Ethan felt a surge of determination. Whatever secrets lay in the past, he would uncover them. And whatever threat lingered, he would protect his son from it. Benji had been through enough, and Ethan would make sure his new life wasn't tarnished by the shadows of the old one. As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, Ethan made a silent vow. He had been given a second chance, and he wouldn't let anything or anyone take it away. Ethan's sense of unease deepened over the next few days. He kept close tabs on Benji, making sure the boy was never out of sight for long. The investigator had promised to dig further into the man connected to the estate, but the wait for answers left Ethan restless. He hated feeling powerless, especially now, with so much at stake. Benji had become the center of his world, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing him again. One evening, as Ethan prepared dinner, he heard the soft patter of footsteps behind him. Benji appeared in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper. "I made something for you," he said, his voice shy. Ethan dried his hands and took the paper, his heart swelling as he looked at the drawing. It was a simple scene. A man and a boy standing in front of a house, holding hands. Above them, Benji had written in uneven letters, "My dad and me." Ethan knelt to Benji's level, pulling him into a hug. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." Benji hugged him back, holding on tightly. "I'm glad I found you," he whispered. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "Me too, kid. Me too." The tender moment was interrupted by the sound of Ethan's phone vibrating on the counter. He released Benji and stood, checking the screen. It was the investigator. "Stay here, okay?" Ethan said to Benji before stepping into the hallway to take the call. "I've got something," the investigator said. "It's not good." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Tell me." "The man who was looking for Benji, his name is Victor Crane. He's a former employee of the firm that managed your late wife's estate. It turns out he was fired years ago for embezzling funds." Ethan's jaw tightened. Why would he be interested in Benji? That's the part that doesn't make sense, until you factor in the trust fund your wife set up for your son. It was never closed after the accident. If Benji is confirmed as your heir, that trust is worth a substantial amount. Ethan's chest tightened. "You're saying this guy might be after the money?" "It's possible, but there's more. I found evidence that he tampered with the initial reports of the accident. It's likely he knew Benji survived and intentionally kept it hidden." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened, fury bubbling beneath the surface. Why would he do that? My guess? He wanted time to manipulate the situation, maybe even position himself as a guardian if Benji was ever found. It's a long shot, but with that much money on the line, it's not out of the question. Ethan's mind raced. The thought of someone using Benji for financial gain made his blood boil. What do we do now? "I'd recommend filing for a restraining order immediately," the investigator said. And if you haven't already, you need to tighten security around you and Benji. Consider it done, Ethan said, ending the call. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they painted was ugly. Victor Crane had been lurking in the shadows for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ethan wouldn't give him that chance. That night, Ethan sat Benji down in the living room. The boy looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt for having to burden him with such heavy news. "Benji," he began, his voice gentle, "I need to talk to you about something important." Benji nodded, his expression serious. "Okay, there's a man who's been looking for you," Ethan said carefully. "He's not a good person, and I think he might try to take advantage of you. But I want you to know that I won't let anything happen to you. You're safe with me." Benji's brow furrowed. "Why does he want me?" Ethan hesitated, then decided to be honest. "It might have to do with money. Money your mom left for you before she passed away. But that doesn't matter. What matters is keeping you safe." Benji looked down, his small hands gripping the edge of the couch. "I don't care about the money," he said softly. "I just want to stay with you." Ethan's chest tightened, and he reached out to pull Benji into a hug. "You will," he promised. "No one is going to take you away from me." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Ethan hired a private security team to monitor the house and arranged for legal action against Victor Crane. He also started working with his lawyers to solidify his guardianship of Benji, ensuring there would be no legal loopholes for anyone to exploit. Despite the heightened security, Ethan did his best to keep life as normal as possible for Benji. They continued their nightly routine of reading together, and Ethan made sure to carve out time for fun activities, like trips to the park or baking cookies in the kitchen. He wanted Benji to feel like a kid, not a pawn in someone else's scheme. But the tension was never far from Ethan's mind. He spent hours in his office, poring over documents and coordinating with his team to protect his son. The weight of responsibility was immense, but he refused to let it overwhelm him. Benji was worth every sleepless night, every moment of worry. One afternoon, as they were leaving the park, Ethan noticed a man lingering near the entrance. He was dressed in a plain jacket and baseball cap, his eyes scanning the area. Something about him set off alarm bells in Ethan's mind. "Benji," Ethan said quietly, "stay close to me." Benji obeyed without question, his small hand slipping into Ethan's. They walked briskly to the car, and Ethan glanced over his shoulder just in time to see the man watching them. As they drove away, Ethan's heart pounded. He called the head of his security team and described the man, instructing them to investigate immediately. The encounter had been brief, but it was enough to reinforce Ethan's resolve. He couldn't afford to take any chances. That evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Benji looked up at Ethan. "Do you think he's going to find us?" he asked softly. Ethan reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Benji's. "No," he said firmly. "We're one step ahead of him, and we're not going to let him win." Benji nodded, his trust in Ethan unwavering. "I believe you." Ethan's determination hardened. He had built empires, faced down competitors, and weathered storms in the business world, but nothing had ever mattered as much as protecting his son. Victor Crane had underestimated him, and Ethan intended to make sure he regretted it. As the night wore on, Ethan tucked Benji into bed, sitting beside him until his breathing grew steady and even. He stayed there for a while, watching his son sleep, and made a silent promise to himself. Whatever it took, he would protect Benji. He had lost him once, but he wouldn't lose him again. The days passed with an uneasy tension hanging in the air. Ethan doubled down on security, ensuring every measure was in place to protect Benji. He had guards stationed outside the house, cameras monitoring every corner, and even a secure panic room installed in case of emergencies. Still, the threat of Victor Crane lingered in his mind like a storm cloud, dark and unpredictable. Benji, to his credit, seemed to be adjusting well despite the increased precautions. He had settled into his new school, made a few friends, and even started taking soccer more seriously. Ethan attended every practice, sitting on the sidelines and cheering as if he were watching a championship game. It wasn't just about supporting Benji, it was about showing him that he wasn't alone anymore. One afternoon, as Ethan watched Benji sprint across the field during a game, His phone buzzed. It was the investigator again. Ethan stepped away from the crowd, answering the call with a sense of urgency. "We've confirmed Victor Crane's location," the investigator said. "He's staying at a motel on the outskirts of the city." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Has he made any moves?" "Not yet, but he's been asking around about you and Benji. My guess is he's waiting for the right moment." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "Do the police know?" "They've been informed, but until he makes a direct threat or attempt, their hands are tied. He's walking a fine line, and he knows it." Ethan's frustration simmered. The thought of Victor Crane lurking, waiting for an opportunity to strike, made his blood boil. "Keep me updated," he said before ending the call. As he returned to the sidelines, he forced a smile for Benji, who was waving enthusiastically after scoring a goal. Ethan clapped and cheered, pushing his worries aside for the moment. Benji needed to feel safe, and Ethan was determined not to let anything ruin his son's newfound happiness. That evening, back at home, Ethan decided it was time to address the situation directly with Benji. He sat the boy down in the living room, speaking in a calm but serious tone. "Benji, I need to tell you something," he began. "The man I mentioned before, the one who's been looking for you, we know where he is. He hasn't done anything yet, but we're keeping a close eye on him." Benji frowned, his small hands gripping the edge of the couch. "Why does he want me?" Ethan hesitated, then decided to be honest. "He's after money, money that your mom left for you. But it's not just about that. I think he wants to use you to get to me." Benji's eyes widened. "But I don't care about the money." "I know," Ethan said gently, "but some people will do anything for it, even hurt others. That's why I've taken steps to keep us safe. You don't need to worry about him. I won't let him hurt you." Benji nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "I don't understand why people have to be like that. Why can't they just leave us alone?" Ethan sighed, placing a reassuring hand on Benji's shoulder. "I wish I had a good answer for that. But what I do know is that we're a team now, and we'll face whatever comes our way together." Benji gave him a small smile, the trust in his eyes shining through. "Okay, I trust you." The words strengthened Ethan's resolve. He wouldn't let Victor Crane, or anyone else, take away the life they were building together. 2 days later, Ethan was in his office when the head of his security team burst in. "We've got a situation," the man said, his voice clipped. "Crane was spotted near the school this afternoon." Ethan's heart dropped. Was he trying to get to Benji? No, but he was asking questions about the students. "We've already reported it to the police, but he slipped away before they arrived." Ethan stood, his fists clenched at his sides. "Double the security at the school. I don't want him getting within a mile of my son." "It's already being handled," the security chief assured him. "But I thought you'd want to know." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. It was clear Victor Crane was escalating, testing the limits of how close he could get. Ethan needed to act before the man made his move. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat by the window in the living room, staring out at the quiet street. The thought of Crane lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike, was enough to keep his adrenaline surging. He knew he couldn't rely solely on security measures and legal channels. He had to confront the threat head-on. The next morning, after dropping Benji off at school, Ethan drove to the motel where Crane was staying. His security team trailed him, ready to intervene if things got out of hand. Ethan parked outside the rundown building, his jaw set with determination. Inside the motel, it didn't take long to find Crane. He was sitting at a table in the corner of the small lobby, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. When he saw Ethan approach, his expression shifted to one of smug amusement. Well, Crane said, leaning back in his chair. "Mr. Donovan, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. "Stay away from my son." Crane smirked. "Your son? Funny, I don't recall seeing your name on his file for the last 10 years. Ethan's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Whatever game you're playing, it's over. I know about the trust fund. I know you've been after it since the beginning." Crane's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Is that what you think? That this is about money?" "I don't think." "I know," Ethan said sharply, "and I won't let you use Benji to get it." Crane stood, his demeanor shifting to one of feigned innocence. "You're awfully defensive for someone who's only recently decided to play daddy. Where were you all those years when he needed you?" Ethan's anger flared, but he refused to take the bait. "I've spent every day since finding Benji making up for the time we lost. You, on the other hand, have spent years plotting how to exploit him. It ends now." Crane's eyes narrowed, his smugness giving way to cold calculation. "You think you can just barge in here and tell me what to do? You don't know who you're dealing with." Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "No, you don't know who you're dealing with. I've built empires, taken down men twice as ruthless as you, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect my son. Walk away now, or I'll make sure you regret ever coming after him." For a moment, Crane said nothing, his gaze locked with Ethan's. Then he shrugged, his smirk returning. "We'll see about that." Ethan turned and walked away, his heart pounding. He had delivered his warning, but he knew it wasn't over. Crane wouldn't give up easily, but Ethan was ready for whatever came next. Benji was counting on him, and he wouldn't let him down. Back at home that evening, Ethan sat with Benji as they worked on a puzzle together. The boy seemed happier, more at ease, and Ethan drew strength from his son's resilience. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As Ethan watched Benji laugh at a joke he had made, he felt a deep sense of purpose. This was his family, his reason to fight, and he would do everything in his power to keep it safe. The days following Ethan's confrontation with Victor Crane were tense, but Ethan refused to let fear dictate his or Benji's life. He kept his security team on high alert, coordinated daily with the investigator, and ensured every possible precaution was taken. Yet, amid the unease, he made a conscious effort to shield Benji from the worst of it. The boy had already endured more than enough uncertainty, and Ethan wanted him to feel safe and loved, no matter what was happening behind the scenes. One crisp Saturday morning, Ethan and Benji went to the park. Benji had insisted on flying the new kite Ethan had bought him, and Ethan couldn't resist the boy's excitement. As Benji ran across the open field, the kite soaring higher with each tug of the string, Ethan felt a rare moment of peace. Watching his son's joy, he was reminded of why he was fighting so hard to protect this life they were building together. "Dad, look how high it's going," Benji shouted, waving enthusiastically. "You're a natural," Ethan called back, grinning. For a moment, everything felt normal. The looming shadow of Victor Crane seemed to fade, replaced by the simple happiness of a father and son enjoying the day. But as Ethan glanced toward the edge of the park, his smile faltered. A man stood near the trees, partially obscured by the shadows. Even from a distance, Ethan's instincts told him who it was. Victor. Ethan's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He didn't want to alarm Benji or give Crane the satisfaction of knowing he'd rattled him. Instead, he called out, "Benji, let's head back. I think it's time for lunch." Benji trotted over, his kite trailing behind him. "But we just got here." "I know," Ethan said, crouching to his level. "But we've got burgers waiting at home, and you don't want to miss those, do you?" Benji hesitated, then grinned. "Okay, can I bring the kite?" "Of course," Ethan said, ruffling his hair. He took Benji's hand, and they walked back to the car, Ethan glancing over his shoulder just once to confirm what he already knew. Victor Crane was watching them. As soon as they were home, Ethan made 2 calls. The first was to his security team, ordering them to track Crane's movements and ensure he didn't get anywhere near the house. The second was to the investigator, demanding updates on Crane's background and potential connections. Ethan's patience was wearing thin. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. That evening, after Benji had gone to bed, Ethan sat in his study, going over the investigator's latest report. It confirmed what he had feared. Crane had been systematically trying to manipulate his way into Benji's life, using the trust fund as leverage. Worse, there were hints that Crane might have connections to other individuals who could pose a threat. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about power and control. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had spent his life building businesses, dismantling obstacles, and outmaneuvering competitors. This wasn't any different. If Crane wanted a fight, Ethan would give him one. The next day, Ethan called his lawyer and began setting a plan into motion. First, he initiated the process of officially transferring Benji's trust fund into a secure account that would be inaccessible to anyone but Ethan and Benji. Second, he filed an emergency restraining order against Crane, using the man's proximity to the school and the park as evidence of his intentions. Finally, Ethan hired a crisis management team to monitor media coverage and ensure Crane couldn't use public opinion to his advantage. But even as Ethan took these steps, he knew the situation was escalating. Crane was desperate, and desperate men were unpredictable. Ethan couldn't afford to let his guard down, not even for a moment. That evening, as Ethan and Benji sat together in the living room, Benji spoke up. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" Ethan looked at him, his heart aching at the vulnerability in the boy's voice. "Yes," he said firmly. "I promise, Benji. I'm going to keep you safe." Benji nodded, but his small face was still etched with worry. "I trust you." Ethan reached out, pulling Benji into a hug. "And I'll never let you down, no matter what." The following days were a blur of activity. Ethan worked tirelessly with his team, making sure every angle was covered. He barely slept, fueled by sheer determination and the knowledge that failure wasn't an option. But through it all, he made time for Benji. They played games, read stories, and talked about everything from soccer to Benji's favorite superheroes. Ethan refused to let the tension seep into their time together. Benji deserved to feel like a kid, even as the storm brewed around them. Finally, the break Ethan had been waiting for came. The investigator called with a lead, a connection between Crane and a fraudulent legal advisor who had previously been involved in high-profile inheritance cases. With this information, Ethan's lawyer moved quickly, filing a case against Crane for conspiracy and fraud. The restraining order was granted, and law enforcement began monitoring Crane's movements closely. But the real victory came a week later when Crane was arrested outside Ethan's office building. He had been caught trying to bribe a former employee of Ethan's company for access to confidential information. The evidence was damning, and Ethan felt a surge of relief knowing the man was finally being held accountable. That evening, as Ethan sat with Benji at the dinner table, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he could breathe easily, knowing the immediate threat had been neutralized. Benji, oblivious to the details, chatted excitedly about an upcoming school field trip, his face alight with enthusiasm. Ethan smiled, soaking in the moment. This was what he had fought for, a chance to give his son a normal, happy life. As Benji talked, Ethan thought about the road ahead. There would be challenges, no doubt, but he felt ready to face them. Together, they had weathered the storm, and now they could focus on building a future filled with hope and love. After dinner, as Ethan tucked Benji into bed, the boy looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "You're the best dad ever," Benji murmured. Ethan felt his chest tighten, and he leaned down to kiss Benji's forehead. "And you're the best son I could ever ask for." As Benji drifted off to sleep, Ethan sat by his side, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. He thought about the journey that had brought them here. The pain, the loss, the unexpected reunion. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every moment. For the first time in years, Ethan felt at peace. His family was whole again, and the future stretched out before them, bright and full of possibilities. The weeks that followed Victor Crane's arrest were a turning point for Ethan and Benji. With the immediate threat gone, Ethan found himself able to focus fully on their new life together. The house that once felt cold and empty now buzzed with warmth and laughter. Benji had transformed the space, filling it with his drawings, his soccer trophies, and his endless questions about the world. Each day brought new challenges, but also new joys as they discovered what it meant to be a family. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan and Benji stood on the front porch, preparing for the boys' first school field trip. Benji was buzzing with excitement, his small backpack slung over his shoulders, and his face lit up with anticipation. "Are you sure you packed everything?" Ethan asked, crouching to check the straps on the backpack. "Yes, Dad," Benji said with an exasperated grin. "I have my lunch, my water bottle, and my permission slip. I'm not a baby, you know." Ethan chuckled. "I know you're not. I'm just making sure. It's my job to worry." Benji rolled his eyes playfully, but gave Ethan a quick hug before running to the waiting bus. As Ethan watched him go, he felt a swell of pride and gratitude. Every step forward felt like a victory, a reminder of how far they had come. The day passed quietly, and Ethan used the time to catch up on work. But as he sat in his office reviewing contracts, his thoughts kept drifting back to Benji. He marveled at the resilience of his son, at the way he had adapted to this new life with such grace and courage. Benji had been through so much, yet he carried himself with a quiet strength that inspired Ethan every day. By the time the school bus returned that afternoon, Ethan was waiting at the curb. Benji bounded off, his face flushed with excitement as he waved a sheet of paper in the air. "Look what I made," Benji exclaimed, running toward Ethan. Ethan crouched to take the paper, his heart swelling as he studied the drawing. It was a picture of the two of them standing side by side in front of their house, with the words "me and my dad" written in bold letters at the top. "It's amazing," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a talented artist, you know that?" Benji beamed. "My teacher said I should keep drawing because I'm good at it." "She's right," Ethan said, pulling him into a hug. "You should never stop." Later that evening, as they sat together on the couch, Benji turned to Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" he asked softly. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He took a deep breath before answering. "I know she would be. She loved you so much, Benji. And she would be so proud of the boy you've become." Benji smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. "I think about her sometimes. I wish I could remember more." Ethan reached out, taking Benji's hand in his. "She's always with us, in the way we love each other and the way we take care of each other." "That's what she would have wanted." Benji nodded, his small hand tightening around Ethan's. "I'm glad we have each other." "So am I," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. More than anything, the weeks turned into months, and their bond only grew stronger. Ethan took pride in every milestone Benji achieved, from his first A on a math test to scoring the winning goal in a soccer game. But it was the quieter moments that meant the most. The nights spent reading together, the dinners filled with laughter, and the simple joy of being there for each other. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Benji looked up from his plate with a mischievous grin. "So, when are we getting a dog?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "A dog?" "Yeah," Benji said, his grin widening. "We have a big yard, and I think a dog would make it feel even more like home." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "You don't waste any time, do you?" "Nope," Benji said, his eyes sparkling. "So, can we?" Ethan pretended to think it over, tapping his chin. "I suppose we could start looking, but only if you promise to help take care of it." "I promise," Benji said, practically bouncing in his seat. "I'll walk it and feed it and everything." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "All right then, let's do it." The excitement of choosing a dog became a new adventure for them, and a few weeks later, they brought home a golden retriever puppy they named Max. Benji and Max were inseparable from the start, and the house felt even livelier with the addition of the playful pup. One night, as Ethan stood in the doorway of Benji's room, watching his son sleep with Max curled up at his feet, he felt a deep sense of peace. The journey that had brought them here had been long and painful, but it had also been worth it. They had found each other, and together, they had built something beautiful. Ethan thought back to the 5 wishes Benji had shared the night they first met. A warm bed, a full meal, a family, a chance to go to school, and a father. Each one had been fulfilled, not through magic, but through love, persistence, and the bond they had forged. As Ethan turned off the light and closed the door, he felt a quiet certainty settle over him. Their story wasn't perfect, and it wasn't finished, but it was theirs, and it was filled with hope. Forever, no matter what. Stories like Ethan and Benji's remind us of the incredible power of love, second chances, and never giving up on the people we care about. What would you do if life gave you a second chance to reunite with someone you love? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to check out our next videos for more heartwarming reunions and emotional journeys. See you there.